This happened on Monday, August 23, 1999. I left home early in the morning for work, but let's get straight to the point. I never reached my destination. On the way, I had an accident that, by all estimates, should have been fatal. However, defying all expectations, I managed to survive. My first memory after the accident was being in the hospital, with a very clear feeling. During that short period, I felt that my soul had left my body 6 times. Mikhail Ovchinnikov recounted this experience. Throughout his life, he worked as a test engineer in the aerospace field. In his spare time, he enjoyed painting. However, when he turned 50, he decided to take a different path and became a priest. For him, 1999 marked a turning point in his life, as he was on the brink of death, an experience that profoundly transformed him. As he hovered between life and death, resuscitator Zhana Rachenkova said that her first impression was that Mikhail no longer belonged to this world. At such critical moments, doctors were faced with very difficult decisions. Surprisingly, Mikhail managed to survive, although he himself claimed that it was a different existence, as if his life was taking place on another plane, in a parallel reality. Reflecting on his experience, Mikhail accurately described what he experienced after the accident. According to him, the first thing I perceived after August 23rd was a gloomy scene, as if I was in front of an unfamiliar table. I felt that my soul had abruptly and quickly left my body. I remember it with absolute clarity. At that moment, all physical pain disappeared, and I was overcome by a feeling of indescribable lightness, similar to inhaling the purest air for the first time. Little by little, I began to notice sounds and colors around me. It was a world of indescribable beauty, enveloped in a magical, supernatural light that seemed to flow around me. As a visual creator, Mikhail recounted in detail the images he witnessed. I observed a place filled with intricate and extraordinary flowers, with golden and crystalline reflections. Even the best team of artists in the world would be unable to capture the richness and hues I saw there. These experiences led him to question deep questions. Had he had a glimpse of another world, or were they simply images created by his mind due to his critical condition? Mikhail reflected that, in his perspective, people who go through extreme moments, such as being on the verge of death, develop a spiritual perception that allows them to see things that are beyond the reach of others. What marked him most was meeting, through that vision, his former spiritual guide, the priest Konstantin Ovchinnikov, an event that left an indelible impression on his existence. Mikhail Ovchinnikov's existence seemed to have come to an end years before this event. However, what he experienced was very different from the typical delusions that are usually associated with extreme pain or the effects of strong medications. Normally, in these circumstances, the human mind tends to retrieve fragmented memories, mixing images of living and deceased people into confusing and surreal scenarios. But, in Mikhail's case, the experiences he recounted were clear, meaningful and charged with purpose. During what he called the transition of his soul, Mikhail claimed to have interacted only with deceased people who had been close to him in life. According to his description, these meetings were not chaotic, but deeply revealing. Among them, one in particular stood out. The meeting with his spiritual guide, the priest Konstantin Ovchinnikov, which he described as a moment lived at the door of eternity. When they met, Konstantin gave him a kind smile, and soon after, another elderly man joined them. "You arrived earlier than expected," his mentor commented in a light, jovial tone. After returning to life, Mikhail was often asked about this encounter. When asked about how Konstantin was dressed, he always replied that he could not remember specific details, except for his deeply expressive eyes and the warm smile that lit up his face. The communication between the two required no words. Their glances were enough to convey everything that was needed. "I realized that souls have an extraordinary ability to communicate in this way," Mikhail explained. "The saying that the eyes are the mirror of the soul took on a whole new meaning for me." Although the physical details of his mentor's attire faded with the passage of time, the conversation remained deeply etched in his memory. It was no trivial exchange. Konstantin, his spiritual guide, touched on fundamental themes in his life, offering him guidance even at this decisive moment. During their exchange, Konstantin offered neither criticism nor praise toward Mikhail. Instead, he listened attentively as he reflected on his mistakes and decisions along his path. At one point in the exchange, Mikhail spoke of the feelings of guilt that tormented him and confessed some of his mistakes. Konstantin, with a gentle smile, replied, "It is good that you are aware of it. Now you must go back and always remember it. Share with others what you have experienced." These words left a deep mark on Mikhail. Another memorable meeting was with his mother, who had passed away after facing a long illness. Mikhail described her as a figure full of love and resilience. Her eyes radiated tenderness, and although she did not express a word about the difficulties she had suffered in life, her gaze said it all. At that moment I understood that the earthly complaints and laments that we so often express are, for the most part, worthless, Mikhail reflected. Both experiences left Mikhail with a new perspective on life, love, and the importance of sharing lessons learned. Although he faced great hardship and pain upon returning to the physical world, these experiences provided him with the strength to move forward and carry out what he considered his purpose. After his return, Mikhail Ovchinnikov faced a difficult process of physical recovery. This period did not bring back good memories for him, so he preferred not to talk too much about it. However, he was determined to validate what he had experienced during his near-death state. To do so, he dedicated himself to reading similar stories, delving into studies conducted by doctors and scientists, as well as exploring the stories of others who had also been on the brink of eternity. Many of these stories coincided in describing a place of indescribable beauty. Those who had gone through these experiences often mentioned how these experiences transformed their way of seeing life, leading them to understand how fragile existence can be. "Imagine, for example, that you find out that today might be your last day," said Mikhail Ovchinnikov. "Such an experience compels you to live every day as if it were your last. Perhaps you have wondered what happens after death or what kind of bond might persist between us and those who have already left this world. Some people think that death means the end, while others believe that it is just a step towards a new way of existence. Today we will explore the interesting observations and studies conducted by Professor Georgy Znamensky, who dedicated his life to investigating the enigma of how the living interact with those who have passed away. Georgy Alexandrovich Znamensky, a renowned expert in psychology, dedicated his career to collecting stories and evidence related to the phenomena of apparitions of deceased people. In one of his analyses, he documented the case of a young man whose hair turned completely white overnight due to a traumatic event. This young man, who was an acquaintance of the professor, shared his personal experience. He had been deeply in love with a woman with whom he had plans to marry. All preparations for the wedding were underway, but a few weeks before the expected day, his fiancée fell seriously ill and died 3 months later. Devastated by the loss, the young man tried to move on with his life, although he never managed to completely erase the memory of his beloved. On one occasion, due to work commitments, he traveled to a city in the Inskaya province, where his relatives offered him lodging in a separate room in their home. That night, while he was trying to fall asleep, the family dog, who was keeping him company in the room, began to make restless growls. Thinking that perhaps a cat had gotten into the room, he turned on the light to inspect, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The space, bathed in moonlight, seemed completely quiet. However, the dog continued to behave strangely. Its fur bristled and seemed to react to something that was not visible. The narrator constantly relived that night in his mind. Although he was not a fearful man, what had happened had left him deeply shocked. The dog, who had initially been calm, began to show signs of fear, and it was not long before he himself felt a presence in the room. Moments later, in front of him, appeared the figure of his deceased fiancée. I must admit that up to that point, not only did I not believe in God or follow religious practices such as fasting or sacred rituals, but I even used to make fun of those who did, he confessed. However, that evening, my fiancée appeared to make me reflect and transform my ideas. She suggested that I read spiritual texts dealing with the immortality of the soul. The next morning, the young man came down to have tea, but the reaction of the relatives who welcomed him left him deeply shocked. Over the course of that single night, his hair had completely changed, turning completely gray. Later, recounting what happened, Professor Georgy Znamensky reflected on the case. It is not possible to say with certainty why deceased people return to our world or for what purpose they do so, he noted. However, it seems clear that not all souls manifest themselves, and when they do, it can be a disturbing experience for those who are not prepared to deal with it. Znamensky explained that accounts of apparitions of deceased people are often linked to meaningful messages. Often these souls appear to persuade skeptics about the immortality of the soul and the existence of a plane beyond life, shedding light on the purpose of our earthly existence, he said. At other times, they appear before their loved ones to provide comfort, assuring them that they will one day meet again, or to warn them about the direction they are taking in their lives. In addition, the professor noted that the deceased often ask to be prayed for. Through dreams or conscious experiences, these souls request our prayers, he said. Among the cases Znamensky highlighted was one that occurred on July 16, 1871, when Archbishop Neil had a curious encounter in a dream. In this dream, a young singer, who had died of cholera at the age of 24, appeared to the archbishop. Dressed in his trademark frock coat, the singer quickly approached the table where the archbishop was sitting and began to take copper coins out of his pockets, dropping them onto the surface. Intrigued by his behavior, the archbishop asked him what he was doing. The young man replied, "I didn't have time to settle my debt with the photographer." The archbishop recalled that a day earlier, a photographer had visited him to inform him that the singer owed him 4 rubles. During the dream, the archbishop promised the young man that he would pay what he owed. Still curious, Neil asked him, "Where are you now?" To which the singer replied ambiguously, mentioning that he was not in a good place, but neither was he among those he described as the trash. Upon awakening, the archbishop complied with the singer's request, making sure to pay the photographer's debt. According to Znamensky, stories like this show how the souls of the deceased try to resolve unfinished business on the earthly plane or, in some cases, remind the living of the importance of prayer and spiritual connection. Apart from duty, do not forget to pray for me. These were the words that echoed in my mind that night. Until then, I had never reflected on the value of prayers for those who have already departed. Hearing this plea, I was deeply moved. I apologized to the singer for not having organized memorial services for the 40th day after his passing and promised to do so. After these words, my visitor disappeared, Archbishop Neil recounted. In an episode in 1850, a young man named Selin had a similar experience after his father's unexpected death. Due to unfortunate circumstances, Selin was unable to attend the funeral, which plunged him into deep sadness. A year later, he decided to return to his hometown and, once there, visited his father's grave. On a spiritually charged day, he dedicated his time to praying fervently for his deceased father. While he was in prayer, he had a vision that deeply impacted him. His father appeared to him, and Selin, filled with wonder and emotion, exclaimed, "No, I cannot believe that you are dead." In a calm voice, his father replied, "No, my son, I am not completely dead." Then, his father's spirit bowed before him in a gesture of gratitude. "Father, what do you want to tell me?" asked Selin, deeply moved. His father, bowing again, replied, "Thank you for keeping me present in your prayers. If you look closely, you will understand that we are souls who still carry thoughts tied to the earthly world. That is why we especially need your prayers, as they help us to transcend the earthly and rise towards heaven." Professor Georgy Znamensky reflected on stories like this and concluded that prayers addressed to the deceased are not only important, but essential. According to his analysis, these prayers function as a link between those still living and souls who long for peace and redemption, making it easier for them to free themselves from the ties that bind them to the earthly world and achieve fulfillment in the afterlife.